China's ambassador to Canada saying canola tariffs will be dropped if Canada drops its tariffs on Chinese-made electric vehicles.
Canada has 100% tariffs right now on Chinese electric vehicles, and that's good for the Ontario auto industry. But China responded with tariffs on Canadian canola.
Prime Minister to do exactly what Beijing has offered, which would be to drop the 100% tariffs on EVs in exchange for them to drop those 100% tariffs on canola products.
It began quietly, without headlines or breaking news alerts. While Washington turned up the pressure on Canada with tariffs and sharp rhetoric over autos and steel, a different voice reached out from across the Pacific. Beijing started opening its doors, offering access to vast markets, and talking about trade in energy, agriculture, and the growing electric vehicle sector. For decades, Canada's economy had moved in step with the United States, its largest and closest trading partner. But when the tariffs hit and tensions deepened, something shifted in Ottawa. Leaders began to see the risk of relying too heavily on one ally, no matter how long-standing or familiar that bond had been. As China offered a new path forward, a quiet question began to surface. Was Canada realigning its future away from Washington's shadow? Tensions between Washington and Ottawa reached a boiling point in early October. At a business forum in Toronto, U.S., Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick delivered a sharp message that landed like a thunderclap. When it came to vehicle production, it would be America first, Canada second. The statement carried weight beyond words. It came with the threat of a 25% tariff on cars and auto parts shipped from Canada into the United States. For Ontario, home to the country's auto industry, the warning struck hard. Nearly 500,000 jobs depend on that cross-border supply chain, a system so deeply intertwined that every vehicle built in Canada contains roughly half of its components made in American factories. For decades, the two economies had moved in tandem, but the tariff threat signaled the start of an unraveling. As the story spread, markets reacted almost instantly. Ottawa's trade experts issued a stark projection. Billions could vanish from Canada's auto exports, setting off job losses across steel, aluminum, and manufacturing sectors. Even U.S. economists warned that such tariffs would raise production costs and cut into profits for American automakers. Yet, the Trump administration refused to back down. Washington's stance was clear. Production should shift to U.S. soil, regardless of how much pain it caused across the border. That moment marked a turning point for Canada's economic direction, one that would lead policymakers to quietly reconsider decades of alignment with their southern neighbor. For years, Canada had followed the American lead on trade policy, even echoing Washington's tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. Yet, instead of being rewarded for loyalty, it found itself targeted by new penalties. The Trump administration viewed trade less as cooperation and more as competition. While Washington tightened its grip, Beijing saw an opening. China began reaching out, signaling its readiness to ease restrictions on Canadian agricultural exports and explore partnerships in clean energy and electric vehicles. For Canada, still grappling with Chinese tariffs on canola and other crops, the gesture was meaningful. Beijing's message was straightforward. Open your market to affordable Chinese EVs, priced between $35,000 and $40,000 Canadian dollars, and in return, China would reopen its vast consumer base to Canadian farm goods. The logic was hard to ignore. Canadian farmers would regain access to a billion-person market, while consumers would gain lower-cost EV options that supported the country's climate goals. The timing was strategic. With the U.S. imposing a 100% tariff on Chinese EVs, Beijing needed another foothold in North America. Canada's growing frustration with Washington made it an attractive candidate. In Ottawa, the proposal sparked intense debate. There were clear economic advantages, but also the risk of angering Washington. Yet diversification was becoming less of a choice and more of a necessity. Canada's leaders understood that the old assumption that economic survival depended on American goodwill no longer held true. China was not a replacement for the United States, but it offered leverage that Canada had long lacked. For the first time in years, Ottawa had a genuine choice. By mid-October, that shift began to take shape in public policy. Prime Minister Mark Carney's administration announced new funding for manufacturing and energy sectors, coupled with measures to protect industries threatened by U.S. tariffs. Ontario's Premier Doug Ford pushed for programs to safeguard auto workers from job losses. Canada also lifted some retaliatory tariffs to signal openness to dialogue, but maintained a 25% duty on American-made vehicles entering Canada. The message was firm but balanced. Canada was willing to cooperate, but not to be cornered. Officials began calling the new approach sectoral resilience, a strategy that moved away from large, sweeping trade pact towards smaller, targeted agreements with multiple partners. The goal was to spread economic risk and reduce dependence on any single country. This philosophy aligned perfectly with China's outreach. Canadian firms in the EV and battery industries were already turning to Asia for investment. Chinese companies, in turn, were eager to access Canada's reserves of critical minerals like lithium and nickel. What emerged was not defiance, but pragmatism, a decision to build strength through flexibility rather than dependency. The transformation was quiet but deliberate. Canada was not abandoning the United States, but it was learning to navigate a world where Washington's protectionist impulses could no longer be taken as temporary. The idea that shared history and geography guaranteed shared prosperity had been replaced by a new realism. In this new landscape, economic survival meant adaptability. By late autumn, Ottawa's tone had changed. Trade officials spoke less about defending Canada's place within the North American market and more about expanding its global footprint. Conversations with Asian and European partners grew more frequent. Investment missions to Seoul, Tokyo, and Singapore followed. Even within the private sector, attitudes were shifting. Canadian automakers began exploring joint ventures with Asian EV producers, and mining firms sought new supply contracts outside the United States. Behind closed doors, policymakers acknowledged what had long been unspoken. The world was entering an era of fragmented trade blocs, and Canada could no longer afford to stand in just one camp. Aligning too closely with Washington meant exposure to its political volatility. Diversifying toward Asia offered balance, even if it carried diplomatic risks. That Canada's recalibration was not an act of rebellion, it was an act of preservation. By embracing flexibility, Ottawa sought to protect its industries, safeguard its workers, and prepare for a future no longer anchored solely to American fortunes. In that quiet but decisive shift, Canada began redefining its place in the global economy, not as a follower, but as a nation charting its own path forward. Trump's tariff campaign were beginning to produce the opposite of its intended effect. According to data from the U.S. Department of Commerce, prices for steel and aluminum had risen nearly 20% since early 2025. Vehicle costs climbed, factory profits thinned, and assembly lines in industrial states like Michigan and Ohio began slowing down. Industries that relied on cross-border trade were feeling the squeeze. Economists of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago calculated that every 10% increase in tariff costs reduced manufacturing output in the Midwest by roughly 2%. The broader consequences for Washington were becoming impossible to dismiss. Instead of solidifying alliances, the White House had weakened them. Canada's engagement with China signaled that the United States could no longer assume its northern neighbor's unconditional alignment. Ottawa's shift was not an act of rebellion, but one of survival. Confronted with rising barriers and diminishing trust, Canada chose to adapt. It diversified its trade routes, reinforced its domestic industries, and began charting a path no longer dependent on the goodwill of a single partner. That evolution is already visible in the numbers. Canadian exports to Asia are steadily climbing, and ongoing talks with Beijing hint at broader economic cooperation ahead. Within Canada, a growing awareness has taken hold that dependence on one market, no matter how large, can transform into vulnerability overnight. Trump's economic policies, built on pressure and tariff, have revealed a critical truth. Strength in trade cannot be sustained through threats. While Washington continues to measure influence by control, Canada has begun measuring it through choice. And if the partnership with Beijing deepens, the United States risks losing far more than trade. It risks losing the trust that once defined its leadership across the Western world. A similar dynamic is now unfolding across the Pacific. Trump's trade strategy, designed to rebuild American dominance, is instead strengthening others. The administration boasts of billions flowing into the U.S. economy, yet its policies are driving some of America's closest allies to reconsider their reliance. Long-standing partnerships are fraying under the strain of protectionism. In Japan and South Korea, two of America's most steadfast allies, frustration has become increasingly difficult to hide. In Tokyo, dissatisfaction has turned public. Japan's economic minister recently stated that the trade deal with Washington remains incomplete. While the U.S. agreed to lower auto tariffs from 25% to 15%, key sectors such as pharmaceuticals and semiconductors remain unresolved. Without those issues settled, Japan insists there can be no final agreement. Behind the scenes, tensions run even deeper. Washington has asked Japan to invest roughly 550 billion yen to help rebuild American manufacturing in shipbuilding and pharmaceuticals. From the U.S. perspective, it is an investment in shared prosperity. From Tokyo's view, it feels like a demand. Japanese policymakers fear that paying billions to secure tariff reductions could set a dangerous precedent, one that transforms economic partnership into something resembling tribute. Business leaders share those concerns, describing the process as rushed, unclear, and lacking transparency. Until details are finalized, Japan refuses to sign the deal. That resistance marks a rare and significant moment in post-war diplomacy, one of the few times Tokyo has openly pushed back against Washington's economic terms. The uncertainty is already rippling through investment flows. Joint projects are slowing, and the political cost within Japan is rising. Tokyo may risk losing short-term access to American markets, but Washington risks something far greater: the erosion of trust from an ally that has long been central to its presence in Asia, South Korea. The backlash has been even sharper. President Lee Jung has taken a firm stance, declaring that no trade deal will move forward if it undermines national interests. Washington's response was swift and severe. U.S. officials warned that failure to comply would mean reinstating tariffs on Korean exports at 25%. Korean media described the statement not as negotiation, but as ultimatum. The proposed deal requires South Korea to invest $350 billion in U.S. industries, but with Washington controlling both the structure and profit distribution. This arrangement has fueled resentment within Seoul's political and business circles, where many see it as economic coercion disguised as partnership. The tension escalated dramatically earlier this year after a raid at a Hyundai plant under construction in Georgia. U.S. immigration authorities detained several members of Korea's technical team sent to oversee operations,